This is Tabletop Babble, and I'm Amber. Today on the show, I chatted with TTRPG editor, contributor, and designer Tyler Crumrine, who is the founder of the company Possible Worlds Games. Tyler comes from a theater background where he specializes in impossible plays, and of course, I am now obsessed with that concept and genre. We sat down on March 10th and discussed his first game, Beak, Feather, Bone, and how its success and reception pushed him along to building Possible Worlds, where on March 23rd, 2020, his Kickstarter for a micro RPG subscription box will go live. So if you're listening right now, today, which is Monday, March 22nd, the day that this episode released, it's live tomorrow. I'm personally super excited about it, and I really love the concept of an RPG subscription service. And so if you're interested as well, go to possibleworldsgames.com or his Twitter @possiblewgames to find out more about the Kickstarter, and of course, keep on listening to the show because you're going to hear more about it. Hello, Tyler, and welcome to Tabletop Babble. How are you today?
I'm doing well, in pandemic-adjusted terms. We finally just crossed over after a very long cold spell. At one point, my pilot light went out during it, and so I had to get my furnace fixed. But after a very cold winter, we have had a string of 60-degree days, which has been fantastic, which is its own kind of terrifying, just in terms of the planet. But as someone who's been cooped up inside, I'm like, oh, it's nice to be able to, still wear a mask, but at least go on a walk somewhere.
Oh, I know, me too. I'm in Indiana, and today was a 65-degree day, and I went out and I had to go into work physically today, and it was a beautiful sunny day and drive, and it was warm out. The only downside is that we're back to March, and so I'm getting these weird beginning of pandemic memories bubbling up, which I was on a French omelet kick. And I was I'm going to perfect French omelets. That was my beginning of pandemic thing. So that's happening for me.
There was an Instagram conversation I had with another local RPG designer. And the reason why we got back in touch is because they did a second zine quest. And I wanted to reach out to congratulate them. And I realized that the last time we had talked on Instagram was literally us saying hey, do we want to put off meeting up for beer for a week or two? It seems like this whole COVID thing might be pretty serious.
Oh man, and here we are a year later, and whatever. I feel so whatever.
We're still here,
but it's okay. Okay, so we've got a little bit of a chit chat. So Tyler, would you mind, for our listeners, letting people know who you are and what you do in the TTRPG space?
Yeah, I'm Tyler Crumrine, he, him, his, and I design and edit tabletop role-playing games. If anyone knows me from anything, it's probably the zine quest I did a year ago called Beak, Feather, and Bone. It is a map labeling RPG that I was very grateful to have funded during zine quest, and then to be able to continue to support over the last year, because I was working in theater before that, and all of my work disappeared, and I kind of became a full-time game designer by default.
So I actually found you out through a zine quest, I think that's going on right now, Kitchen Nightmares, KNIGHT, which I think you're the editor of?
Yeah, I kickstarted Beak, Feather, and Bone, a map labeling RPG, about a year ago. And that was my first solo RPG that I put out into the world. But even before that, I had been editing for various tabletop Kickstarters. I do a lot of World Champ Game Co's projects. I edited Cobwebs for them, and their Wish You Were Here zine series for the first zine quest. And so every time zine quest rolls around, there are folks who are looking for collaborators, looking for folks who can affordably edit their projects for them, kind of help get them across the finish line of taking a Google document and making it into a bound and print thing. So yeah, I'm working with Chris and Nevin on Kitchen Nightmares. I'm working on Reliquary, which is another project that just funded about far future space station exploration. And I am also working on a handful of other RPGs that funded during the pandemic, and then kind of have like been struggling to gather everything and are now finally in the final stages of like, yes, we're ready to deliver. So I have a theater background, but specifically within theater, I would edit and design play scripts. I'm something called a dramaturg. We are kind of like an editor is to a novel what a dramaturg is to a play. So I would help develop new plays, like cutting room floor. I would be the one who says like, hey, this scene seems a bit superfluous. We could cut this and maybe add something here. Or for something that doesn't need that kind of heavy editing, I might just be the person in the room being like, hey, we should make sure that this character you have in your play, the job description you're having them say out of this actor's mouth is actually what they would do for their job. Like, we want this mid-level executive to sound realistic enough that mid-level executives in the audience aren't taken out of the experience. So I was working on plays behind the scenes, but I was also creating the scripts and publishing perfect bound scripts of acting editions and things, specifically experimental theater with my publishing company, Plays in Verse. So I had been editing RPGs in the background as kind of an extension of that. Just someone who was in the hobby, who had a lot of friends who were Kickstarter creators, who needed an editor, and I was a professional editor who had a knowledge of RPGs. It wasn't until I kickstarted Beak, Feather, and Bone through Zine Quest that I started to spread my wings as a designer myself, really figure out like what are the kind of games that I think I am particularly suited to creating, that I enjoy creating, and also that people kind of want and expect from me. So even if I'm, editing the big like 5e supplement for someone and it's very much in one headspace, it's nice to be able to turn off my headspace there and go more into the theater of the mind type stuff from my performance background, and also like the little simple games that are more kind of improv exercises that I like to write and that I like to play with others.
Yeah. So theater background, I'm going to put a pin in that because I really wanted to talk about that. I'm very interested in it. I've had lots of comedians on here already, like with a formal background in comedy, but I don't think I've had anybody who has done play. So put a pin in that.
Yeah, well, and also please feel free to interrupt me. Like, one thing that is very evident from my theater background is that I have a tendency to monologue. So just if I ever just keep going, just
okay.
Talk over me. That's how we do it in the Crumrine family.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for that permission. I might, because I have ADHD brain that like will see something and then go off and then I forget things. So okay, cool. Thank you. So pin in theater. What came first, RPGs or theater was first? Like how did you get started in RPGs? Either playing maybe?
Yeah, so it was theater first. I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, and so I played football and I was in the plays and musicals. Like, that was my social life. And I really loved theater, in part because of the same reasons that I love football. Because as like a little fat kid, I was able to, see myself as a valued member of the team. Like, whether I was a lineman on the field or I was, going up and playing these roles, sometimes roles where I was able to pretend to be someone else with self-esteem issues. I really fell in love in theater that way. It wasn't until I started, really studying theater in college, and even when I started to work professionally in theater after college, that I started to discover more experimental theater. And it was like discovering a new language. It was very much kind of like a cliche anime plot where someone is like, oh, this is my native tongue. And how it's been denied to me all these years. But it really was that, where it's like there are these weird plays that I never knew were out there, because so many plays, if you're not in the right place at the right time, you just don't have a chance to experience them. They're not going to be recorded and put on YouTube. They're not going to be, well, now they're being put on Netflix because of the pandemic. But a lot of times the plays that get published are the plays that they know have the mass market appeal to reach enough like high school theaters that are going to want to perform it and pay performance royalties. So I fell in love like with theater just because I loved acting, I loved playing, I loved rehearsals. But then after falling in love with it, I found my niche within theater as this more experimental literary style. And it was the same with RPGs. I started as an adult playing Dungeons and Dragons with theater and comedy friends because I felt guilty that I had crashed on their couch in New York for 3 months. And I knew that they really want to play Dungeons and Dragons. So I was like, sure, I will invest in all these books. I will teach myself how to DM. I will run a game for you and your wife and her best friend as a way to like enable you all to get into this hobby. And I fell in love with the game through that. You know, I'd always been interested in it, but I grew up among simple mountain folk. So I didn't really have the party required to play games like D&D. And so I got into RPGs through D&D, and then in a very similar process, it wasn't until I got into Kickstarter, and through Kickstarter, the indie scene, and through the indie scene, itch.io, and found that it really was the smaller, simpler, more experiential games that were speaking my language. As far as like, okay, baseline hobby, I'm here for all of it, but when I have my druthers, this is what I gravitate towards.
My experience with plays, and I loved the plays and musicals I got to see when I was in high school and stuff, are like your, I don't know, Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, or like those kinds of things. So I want to know, because I know like experimental RPGs as far as like what's on itch and the indie scene. What are like experimental plays?
Okay, so I'm glad you asked. My specialty is something called impossible theater. So literally plays that cannot be performed.
I love that contradiction so much.
Yeah, see, the idea is it's kind of like lyric games.
Okay. Okay.
So the idea of a lyric game sometimes is that playing the game or reading the game equates to playing the game, you know? Like, the experience is you're reading it much like you would read a book of poetry, and it's kind of talking you through the mental theater headspace of, like, what would playing this game be like? So there's definitely the option to perform it. You might have to get creative. If the lyrical game says, okay, go and now rocket yourself into space or something, you can't literally do that, but a writer can write that. And maybe that's part of the game experience that they're trying to paint for you. With impossible theater, you use all of the conventions of theater, the formatting of like, okay, we have characters and line attributions. Italics mean stage directions. You know, we're going to have like the setting and the time up top. And using that toolkit the same way that an RPG would paint a scene of like, hey, here's what this play example would look like. Impossible theater paints a scene of like, what would this play look like, but does not constrain itself to what is affordable or viable or realistic. In impossible theater, you can have a character, you know, like bud a second character off of their shoulder and be like, that's how they enter the scene. And if that serves your metaphor, if that serves like the vibe that you're trying to create, sure, go for it. Because right now, someone's just reading it. If you wanted to produce that play, you could. You'd have to get really creative about it. You'd have to get non-literal about it. But if someone just wants to read it, by the fact that it is framed as a play and not as a book of poetry, not as a short story, you have people who are thinking about it in terms of actors on a stage. Basically, what the genre of playwriting gives you, regardless of whether something is ever performed, is choreography. Because if you say you're a play, then that means there's a stage. And if you have a stage in your writing, then you can have people go on and off stage, regardless of whether that is actually realized in the physical world.
I'm trying to wrap my head around it, and Tyler's been watching me process as I look up to the sky and like fold my brain around this idea. I see what you're saying. So like this is me condensing down, making sure that I kind of get it. It's more like the play is just the framework, and it's when you're reading it, you know that it's, you know, in your mind that it's a play, not necessarily that it's ever going to see a stage.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the idea being that like there's a lot of argument over whether like cereal is a soup, you know? But a lot of that depends on what does the waiter say when they put it down in front of you. Do they say, here's your breakfast cereal, or do they say, here's your dessert soup?
Got it. I got it. That was great. I love it. It hit me in a very good tickle bone. I love that. And I like that for games too, because like you said, like some like with specifically lyric games, like I know that there's a lot of games that I've read, but I've not necessarily played, and the experience of just reading it lets me understand kind of what the play would be like.
Yeah, and there are similar, like, I know there was the Not a Game Jam.
Oh, yep. Mm-hmm.
Things like that. Like, it really, I'm very fascinated by genre because so much of genre is a social construct, and also so much of genre is, by its definition, conservative. Because to assign a genre to something is to put a fence around it. But if you see genre not as a labeling and a grouping mechanism, but rather a tool that you can use as a creator to say, like, yes, this is a game. This text I am handing you is a game. This seashell I am handing you is a game. This tattoo I have on my arm is a game. As the author, you have the grounds to say that. It's on the audience to interpret, what does it mean that they're saying it's a game? And how does their saying it's a game change my interpretation of this?
I love it. It hurts my brain sometimes, but that's fine. It's okay to have a hurt brain every once in a while. It's a different kind of hurt, though. It's like the good kind of hurt.
It's like when your muscles, when you're working out, and like you got to break them down some so they can grow back strong.
Yeah. So D&D would be like the Fiddler on the Roof.
Exactly.
And that was your introduction to the RPG space. So did you stick with D&D? Like, how did you end up transitioning into like the indie scene, which is what you're now primarily kind of like creating in?
Yeah, so I still play D&D.
Sure.
I have on COVID hiatus, but here in Pittsburgh, I had a weekly campaign going for like 2 years. And in part because it is so much like the Kleenex phenomenon, A lot of people, when they say they want to play an RPG, but what they really mean is they want to play D&D. And maybe it's because they've heard actual play podcasts, maybe it's because they aren't aware of the rest of the landscape. But when I play D&D, I know that some of my players are there to play D&D. And so as much as I would love to kind of wean them off of it into a more kind of like rules light system, I know that some of them have invested in the books. I know that at least one of my players is like, part of the fun for him is the math of it. Like, he knows the system well, and he's like, he likes to min-max. And so as a GM, I know that my responsibility is to create scenarios where he can see the fruit of his labors, where like the cool stuff that he has built his character to do, they have opportunities to do it. Whereas I know that two of my other players are just there to like tell jokes and like have some cookies. So it really is kind of like, occasionally I will say to that group, if one of the players can't make it, I'll say to them like, hey, why don't we play like a one shot that maybe appeals to the 2 or 3 people that we're gonna have tonight. But as far as like baseline everybody happy, it's so much easier for me to kind of like hack more kind of rules light and forward thinking, fail forward principles into D&D than say to everyone like, okay, we're playing this now. But in terms of my own writing, I have a book of poetry that was published in 2018, I think it was. Yeah. Late 2017, early 2018. I had a book of poetry that I published just called Adventure Hooks. And it's published by a poetry press, but really all it is like 100, no, maybe it's less than that. I think it's 60, because if I were ever to put out a second edition, I would expand it to 100, because it's out of print now. But it was put out by a poetry press, Cool Skull Press, that focuses on poetry that intersects with game literature.
Oh.
And so usually it was like poetry inspired by Mario Kart and things like that. But I pitched this book to them as like, I'd like to write this book of prose poems that can also be ran as RPG adventures. And so the entire book is prompts that start with, in this adventure, and then, follows on from there. So like, in this adventure, the world is your oyster. Also, you're all literally becoming pearls. Or like, in this adventure, you can fly, but so can everyone else. Or like, in this adventure, like, God is real, but no one believes in him. Little things like that are kind of, those little like iceberg prompts. And different ones would kind of go further into like metaphors for social justice or elaborate jokes. But it was a lot of fun to write, and it was a lot of fun to read and perform. But it was also kind of in that middle area where people didn't know what to do with it. Poetry people found it and they're like, this is cool, but like, what? This is unlike anything else I've read before. And then RPG people would find it and be like, this is interesting, but it's not particularly useful. It's more just kind of a book.
I find it completely useful because, like, literally when you said there's a God, but nobody believes that he exists or they exist. I'm like, that's a beautiful game where I could just already imagine, like, somebody has to be the God and they're trying to do all these things to get people's attention.
Yeah, and
to recognize them. And I'm like, this is such a good game inspiration. I feel like I am always looking for things to be inspired by. Like, that sparks my head, because I feel sometimes I can sit by myself and I can come up with a couple ideas, or maybe I hang out with some friends and we come up with some ideas, but to find like a poetry book to find inspiration that is centered around adventure hooks is such a cool idea.
Thank you. It's part of why I love theater too. Like, I'm not really interested in talking at people, Like, I've tried to write conventional poetry. I've tried to write short stories, even like a failed attempt at a novel, and I can't get through it because like I get super self-conscious. Like, the editor in me overrides any kind of forward motion. And it's also just one of those things where, like, I am a straight white male. There are very few things that I feel like my teeth will fall out if I don't have the opportunity to share this experience. And so a lot of what I write is in second person. It's all about you. It's like you're on an adventure. Or even as I'm writing RPGs, like, rules are in second person. It's like, this is what you do. Or in theater, even though the second person isn't used, it's kind of more of like a first person adjacent, where when you're reading a play, you're kind of imagining yourself in an audience, but you're still kind of like picturing these words in actors' bodies, and you're picturing kind of how these actors would interpret the text. I'm far more interested in literature that has that kind of gray area of like, something is expected of you to make this work. We're in this together. I am not telling you a story or telling you how to live your life. I am telling a story with you. And I love RPGs for that same reason, because that is a medium where you can like craft this experience. One of my favorite quotes is by Apadiah Ravencall, probably butchering his last name, but he designed Dread. Really great guy. And a phrase that he's used in podcasts and lessons he's taught in the past is that RPGs are algorithms for emergent storytelling. You have the fixed variables, and you have, which are the rules, and then you have the open variables, which is the input that players put into it. And if the equation is written really well, then once you put it through the equation, on the other side will be an emergent story that is within kind of like an expected parameter. It's like, hey, we're telling a sad story. If the equation's good, it's always going to be a sad story. But it's always going to be an emerging, unique story, because you can't predict what players are going to put into it. With plays, you just have more of the variables being fixed. You know what the characters are going to say. What you don't know is what the environment they're in looks exactly like, how they deliver it, even what bodies are delivering the lines. And, that can add so much to interpretation, too.
Hi, I'm Josh, and I run an actual play podcast that I'd like you to check out. I'm using the Godbound system, and I create a sandbox-style game in a large city called Moxbury. All of the player characters are evil, and I think that this really creates an interesting narrative because...
Nobody cares! I, Azrael, had to reconfigure reality to become the evil saint of Palor. Now I plan to overthrow the government of Moxbury and amass followers. Then I will become...
You wouldn't know the first thing about reconfiguring reality. I did it, not you. I, Milana, want no part of your feeble plans. When my plan comes to fruition, all of Moxbury will become my undead army, with them at my command.
They have to be dead before they become undead. I'm going to silence this entire city and prove myself. Prove Gerlach worthy of the goddess of the void.
No! Leave the monsters. I, Nuak Godslayer, will raise an army of monsters. They will overthrow our human leaders and live free. And I will be there.
Will all you quit your bickering and shut your faces? I, Brimstone, hear enough voices in my head without all of you talking over each other. All I want to do is kill the wizard Shalazar. It doesn't sound too difficult, does it?
If I have my way, it will be. Check out Tales from Moxbury wherever you find your podcasts or geekspective.com.
Well, I'm super glad you found RPGs because it is exactly what you're drawn to, like that collaborative storytelling, that give and pull, we're in it together situation. So transitioning then to your actual writing, the games that you've made, I think you mentioned already Beak, Feather, and Bone. Was that your first one?
Yeah, so it was actually my second game.
Oh.
But I think maybe like a dozen people read my first game. So after I had written Adventure Hooks, Austin Breed, who is the illustrator for Beak, Feather, and Bone, he's the art director on the Possible Worlds subscription box that I'm going to be hawking at the end of this show. But he ran a little RPG zine for a DC zine fair called 50 Feet of Rope. And he asked me to contribute something. And I wrote this little adventure called Oceans D10 plus 1. And it was a little heist thing emulating Oceans 11.
I got it now.
Yeah, and so I had a lot of fun writing that. And because I had this book out and I had done these editing gigs, Big Bad Con, I don't know if they still do it, but they would have a reward tier where they were like, hey, we'll give you bespoke games by emerging indie designers. So they were specifically looking for people who hadn't had big stuff published before. They're like, hey, we'll give you this little curated pack of like 12 micro games. I submitted for that. They accepted it, and I wrote this game called Scene Thieves, which was teaching like 3-act play structure through this heist, where with your players, you are creating the play on like, you know, one side of the screen, and then on the other side of the screen you are also performing a heist using elements of that play. And it's actually one of the games in the subscription box. I've like since refined it, gotten a much better mechanic, because I was still very bogged down in like every game has to have a D20, every game has to have a GM type thinking when I wrote that. But when I was working on Beak, Feather, and Bone, for the longest time I pictured it as a D&D source book. You know, I was going to have this city where I was going to write out what's behind every single door, what's every single NPC in here, and this is going to be a Bible that a GM can pick up and look at it. And the reason why I was writing it is because I hated doing GM prep. And I was like, a book like this would make it so much easier. But then I realized that I was still writing the book. So I was just doing GM prep for everyone, not just my own table. So when that project fell apart, I enjoyed the world that I was creating. I just didn't want to like fill in all the edges in the map. And what I found was that like when I played the setting with my D&D group, the fun of it was like asking the players to help me fill in those edges. And so Beak, Feather, and Bone became this very rules-like game, kind of along the lines of a Quiet Year type game, where players, you know, are given some parameters by cards that are dealt to them, but they represent communities like the miners or the wizards. And they look at a map, like an already drawn out map, and they just take turns saying like, okay, our faction runs this building, and this is what we do here. And like, my faction runs this building and this is what we do here. And then at the end of the game, there's a little bit of math, and you figure out based on what cards were dealt, whose faction is in control of the town. So no matter what was determined, like, oh, the miners have a cannery over here, if it comes down to the fact that like the merchants run town, then the miners are kind of under their thumb to at least a degree. And the idea was to gamify this GM prep that I hated doing. So as I go into this subscription box of microgames, and also as I go into this publishing company for more of my games and more games that I'm going to champion by others, kind of a through line is these like simple, accessible experiences that can be a one-shot on their own, but can also be used to either A, make GM prep fun, or B, be inserted into an ongoing campaign as like a little mini game, kind of along the same way as I've tried to introduce my players to more indie games by saying like, hey, in this D&D location, there is a festival and we're going to have different rules for the festival.
I love that. You wanted to start Beak, Feather, and Bone as this like very large world that you were filling in all the details. And I think some people really like that's something that would appeal to certain GMs, certain groups. But I think with your style, it makes more sense what you did, because I love the Quiet Year as a world building tool that is GM prep. There's other games out there that have used the Quiet Year. I think of Cozy Town by Jammy.
Yeah.
I love it. And like, you just take this and you insert it into incoming game into another game and be like, all right, people, let's all make it up. Let's do it and help me. And I think it kind of helps people also at the table to have more buy-in, more like
people are that much more invested, like what's on the other side of the door.
Yeah.
They played part of the role making that door.
Yes, exactly.
And it was one of those things too where like part of why I'm going in so hard on this second Kickstarter is because I didn't tell anyone about Beak, Feather, and Bone. I didn't tell friends, I didn't tell family, I barely told the designer Discord that I'm a part of that I was even working on this. I just kind of launched it for Zine Quest. And part of that was because of just like crippling imposter syndrome, where I was like, I don't think this is the kind of RPG that people want, but maybe I'm wrong. And I'm not going to pass around the hat. I don't want to have a Kickstarter that funds because like my grandma doesn't want to see me cry. I want to see, like, is this a solid enough pitch that people will go in on it? And when that game, paid my rent for an entire year during a period where all of my other work disappeared, it was very affirming to be like, all right, this thing that I like and I feel like I'm good at, I should probably put some more effort into it and actually make sure that I'm not just surviving on this happenstance, but that I'm positioning myself to thrive, as I make games in the future. And a big part of that has been like starting a company. I did not expect my Kickstarter to do well, so I was not prepared for taxes. Part of why I am kickstarting a project in late March, early April is to pay for those taxes.
Oh no!
But it's one of those things though where like, now that I have an LLC, now I'm going to be better at taxes. And also like now that I have a brand, I'm doing a better job of reaching out to audiences. And I'm also doing a better job of like actually marketing, believing in myself enough to cold call publications and send them press lists and things like that and say like, hey, this is something maybe you would want to take a risk on too. And yeah, so far it's been a real eye-opening process as far as just kind of how the sausage gets made. I feel good about the work that I'm doing, and I would rather be in a position where I try and go all in on this and know by the end of April like where I stand, and pivot if necessary, than like keep acting as if RPGs are my lunch money when really they've been so much more than that for the last year.
Yeah, I was gonna say, one, congratulations, retroactively on your success on that Kickstarter, because that's amazing. I didn't know about it, but I can tell you right now that if I had known about it, I would have backed it, because it's exactly...
Well, you don't have to, because I also released the SRD for it. So the rules are now available for free, because I want folks to be able to hack it and release supplements and things like that. So you can buy Beak, Feather, and Bone and get all the cool Kenku art and like the little world building advice that I give. You can also just download the rules for free and like figure out your own version of it. Or you can go and download hacks that people are making of like, what if instead of Ravenfolk, it was scavengers? And what if instead of the desert, you were on the top of a mountain? And what if instead of claiming homes, you were claiming parts of crashed rockets?
I love it. I bought it. It's $5 on itch. Go get it. It's, even if you never play it, I loved reading through it as just right before this interview. I got it, and I like the art is super good.
Yeah, reading a game is playing a game, just like we talked about.
Inspired me on some things. And I want to comment, like, the art art super great. I love it. It's exactly the kind of stuff I'm into as well. But I also like the layout a lot. I didn't see a layout artist. Did you do that?
I did the layout, yes.
Well, tell me about that.
The plays that I published, I was designing as well, in Adobe InDesign. And really, like, play design is all about visual vocabularies. I'm not one of those people that subscribes to the idea of like all stage directions need to be in brackets. I could care less about those kind of things across the industry. But if a stage direction is in brackets on one page, it should be in brackets on every page. Because what you're doing is you're painting a picture for the reader, a clear visual vocabulary of what this would look like in play. And if you ever break those rules, that's fine too, but it needs to be intentional. If you break the rules that you've established, you are going to be drawing the reader's attention to it. And so you want to make sure that you don't squander that attention. And so as I started to do layout for RPGs, a lot of it is the same. Things like, all right, if you want this key, if moves are capital M moves in this text, let's make sure it's consistent throughout. Or if like you want to, even just little things like, does this need to be bullets? Or does this need to be prose when it could be bullets? It's a lot of that kind of just like visual thinking. And then a lot of it is also just kind of things that you learn through error. I had to learn the hard way that you always want to add at least 1/4 of an inch to the interior margins of any perfect bound book, because the glue in the binding will create a crease that makes it closer to the binding than you actually think it is.
Tyler is speaking from my brain right now as a layout and graphic designer, and I have been clapping this entire time too as an instructional designer. These are things that I do professionally, and it's so. When I looked at Beak, Feather, and Bone and was going there, I was like, huh, who is the layout artist? Because I really like this a lot as a layout designer, and so I love it.
With the SRD, there's a section in the back that tells everyone how I did that.
Oh, perfect.
I
That's
included
wonderful.
a style guide saying, like, here are all the fonts that I used. Here are the sizes I used them at. You know, this underline is actually this, underscore from this font that I have stretched 300%. I just spell all that out because I want people to kind of learn what I did and be able to build on it. The same way that, like, how many games have world in their title if they have powered by the apocalypse mechanics? That is a way to like signal to people like, hey, I am part of this lineage. Going back to like our vocabulary and our like language stuff, like this is speaking a language you already know. And so I don't have like a pithy like powered by bird bones something for it. But I did want to give people the design tools. And I say explicitly, like, hey, you're under no obligation to mimic my design. But if you want this to feel like a piece to this game, I'm flattered. And I am more than happy to, like, let that do some of the marketing legwork for you.
That's wonderful. Just even with your SRD and stuff, making things like that more accessible for people so they can put their games out there is great. And I am a fan of that. So you have dropped a couple times a bit about Possible Worlds Games.
Yes.
That is now your publishing company, correct?
Yeah, it's kind of everything. It's a bit of a personal brand in that I'm still doing editing for people. I'm still picking up clients and things like that. I'm just doing it in a way that looks better on my taxes. But I'm also going to be putting out more of my own games. And so Possible Worlds, the name really comes from my design ethos. You think about games, you think about RPGs. It's different from other games in that RPGs require imagination from their players. So being cognizant of that means creating games that help players see worlds of possibilities, kind of expand their imagination. So Possible Worlds. I'm also trying to create games that model the kind of behavior I want to see in the world. Games that are less like cold number driven calculation type games and that are more like interpersonal communication, conflict resolution in that way type games, rules like games that are largely non-violent. So that is also a possible world that I would like to see and that I hope to manifest through these games. But really and sometimes I worry that I come across as being too clinical about all this, but I think that I want folks to know that it is like a process and that there are so many factors behind turning this pursuit into a career other than just like, oh, I had a good idea for a company. The first thought that I had was, okay, people loved Beak, Feather, and Bone. I loved writing it. This is my sweet spot. I want to make these kind of games. But if I'm going to be a full-time game designer, I don't want to run multiple Kickstarters a year because I will have a heart attack. And but if I'm not running multiple Kickstarters a year, I need to sell more games and I need to charge more for them, which is hard when I've already established, like, I'm the 30-page game guy. And I want to be the 30-page game guy. I do not want to pivot into writing the 5e supplement.
Yeah, but that's the thing is, like, that 30 pages, how much time, effort, energy, art, care goes into it versus... I always say to people, page count doesn't necessarily always equal dollar bills.
Yeah, but it's also that accessibility conversation.
Yeah.
I'm also interested in writing games that have a $5 to $10 price point, because I want folks to be able to take a risk on them, especially for atypical stuff like this. But I also want to make more money. So the concept I came up with was a subscription box, really looking at the way that theaters do subscriptions. So a theater subscription is not like a Patreon subscription. It is not like a cable subscription where you're paying month by month by month. Basically what theaters do is they have subscription season, where it's like a month or two that they prepare for all year, they market the hell out of it, and that's when they announce their 6 shows, and they say, hey, everybody, these are the 6 shows we're going to do. There's a little something for everyone, but they're all baseline good, and if you trust us, then you're going to save money if you buy a subscription to the season, and we'll set up dates for you to come see these 6 shows. And the reason why they do this is so that they have a baseline budget for the rest of the year. If they sell X amount of subscriptions, then yeah, if they're still going to try and do single ticket sales, but if one play outperforms another, if one play like gets middling to awful reviews, they have their bottom line. Their bottom line is from subscriptions. So everything else is kind of gravy, or it's kind of positioning how much can they expand for the following year. By doing a subscription of games, where I'm going to be announcing 6 games. Well, I already have announced at the time of this publication. These 6 games, I'm saying to people like, all right, they're all about 25 pages. They're all kind of within this wheelhouse of the kind of game that you know from me, from Beak, Feather, and Bone. But here's the pitch too. If you buy all 6 of them right now, you can get a digital subscription for $25. And what that'll do is there'll be a new digital game in your itch.io account at the top of each month for the next 6 months. I also have a tier that is just like, hey, if one of these catches your eye, you can back for $5 to just get a digital version of that. It's fine. I'll when it comes out, I'll send you a code. And then the higher tier is a physical subscription option where someone can still get the digital games once a month for 6 months, but on the 7th or 8th month, still figuring out the exact logistics of that, probably the 8th month because I don't want to kill myself, but they will get a box set collecting all these games. And the way I'm printing them is going to be top wire bound as like a steno pad. So you kind of flip it over as you read. For a nice physical artifact, that'll be $50. And I'm going to send it after I've delivered all these digital games. One, so they have the time to finish development on all of these games that are in various states of ready to go. Some just need extra art and layout and things like that. But also so that I can only charge shipping once at the end of the process. Because if I was mailing out a subscription of games, suddenly it'd have to be okay, pony up $3 every month for the next 6 months. And it would also just be a complete headache. So much of how I arrived at my company, how I arrived at my brand and the branding for this subscription Kickstarter was knowing from the start, all right, I want to write this kind of game. I need to make more money. So I need to sell more of this kind of game. What is a way that I can package that? And kind of everything falls from there. It was okay, I know that it's going to be 6 months. If it's over 6 months, I want it to be 6 different genres, so that means people are getting a variety of different stuff. So there's going to be different kinds of worlds. There's going to be a fantasy game. There's going to be a sci-fi game. There's going to be this, that, and the other thing. So I can't have a company brand that is Flaming Broadsword because not all my games are going to be fantasy games. So really it is this process of figuring out a brand, not in terms of what's the catchy thing that's going to make it so that everyone's paying attention to Tyler, but okay, if I know what I want to make, how can I create a brand that reflects me and my priorities?
I think it's a great name. Possible Worlds is just to me it seems like with your aesthetic, right? Your whole ethos and everything and the whole collaborative storytelling, you get to make these possible worlds. But I really am excited about your subscription service because to me, I think one of the hardest things for myself personally is finding new games within the game sets I already like. A lot of times people will say, hey, I'm looking for cozy games, or hey, can you guys send me links to games like this? And to have a subscription service where I just get a PDF at the start of every month, it's hey, check this out. I mean, I already do this with other things in my life, right?
Yeah.
Food subscription. There's wine box stuff, coffee subscriptions, all these subscriptions. I love this for games because I think because I'm lucky and privileged and have a stable job all throughout the quarantine, what I've been trying to do is try to buy stuff from people who haven't had that privilege, especially in the indie space. And this would be something I'm yes, here, I like buying games just to get inspired by. I may never play them. $10 to me personally, it's not too much to spend on a nice bunch of art, and maybe inspires me to run a game. Maybe I play it. Maybe it's a good time. But I just don't have to buy, a Taco Bell a month. Stop doing it. So you said the tiers for the subscription service. I'm assuming with the physical tier, it also comes with digital as well, it's paired together.
Yeah. So everyone's getting digital. Everyone's going to get the trickling out of games. But what it also gives me freedom is I'm going to be working with different independent illustrators for each of these games.
Oh, nice.
Because I also I'm trying to build a company and a brand, not just a Kickstarter.
Yeah.
And part of that is, okay, what is a model that is going to let me present opportunities for other people? So committing early on to say hey, here's the brand style, but I'm going to have a different artist illustrate each of these games. And moving forward, that's going to be what we're going to continue to do. Because these little games, you can have one artist do like a dozen illustrations for it, and it's a really nice visual through line. Also, like, part of this is when people buy a subscription to anything, what they're paying for is the product, but they're also paying for curation. Like, I'm building on the success of Beak, Feather, and Bone to say, like, okay, if you trust my talent as a writer enough, I'm essentially curating 6 of my best games for you. But ideally, down the line, I want to go to other designers and say, like, okay, it's the 3rd year of the subscription box. If it does well, you know, hopefully at this point, we're not relying on Kickstarter. We just kind of have a period where people can buy into the subscription. But to say to other independent game designers, like, hey, that 25-page thing of yours that you don't think is enough to kickstart something, if people trust my taste as a curator, then I can slowly wean myself out of the subscription from writing all 6 games to maybe like, okay, 3 of them are mine, but every other game is going to be an emerging designer that I'm championing, or a short game by someone who usually writes longer games.
This is making me super excited. I'm bouncing in my seat because, like, you're actually using Kickstarter for your business, like what it's supposed to be intended for, to kickstart your business so that you start to build this platform and the financial backing so that you can get away from doing Kickstarters and then potentially publish under Possible Worlds other designers.
Like, I think that anyone going into a Kickstarter, part of their business plan should be, how does this Kickstarter position me to not need a Kickstarter next time? Because Kickstarter likes to brand itself as a community, but it's a marketplace.
Yep.
And it is a platform that is owned by an outside organization. Like, you don't even have to go into like the unionization efforts there or other missteps of other Kickstarters or things like that to even just think in the most broad terms of, if I'm relying on this platform for my business model, then if it's bought by an outside group in 3 years and disappears or drastically changes, am I going to be in a position where my business will survive without it? So I'm not above doing more Kickstarters after this one. If there's a solo project that warrants it, or even if like I need to kind of gather funds on Kickstarter for a second season of the subscription box before it's something that has the cultural capital to survive on its own, I'm fine with that. But I think that people should be aware that, like, it's a tool, it's not a right. And it's a tool that can break. So being responsible to yourself and also your collaborators, if you want to like create more work for people in the future, is making sure that you have contingency plans and that you have an exit plan.
I'm going to say right now that I have already, when this airs, your Kickstarter's live.
It'll be live tomorrow, I believe. So this is the perfect opportunity for people to market as Notify Me at launch. And the people who are those lazy bones that listen on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, they can definitely just go and make that impulse buy right now.
I was going to say, I have already put like Notify Me on launch because I legitimately am excited for this. And I'm like, I just found you, Possible Worlds Games, like I said, through another zine and followed you a couple days ago. And I'm personally like pumped for what is coming. So if people wanted to find you, Tyler, and get excited about what you have out there, where could they do that?
You can follow me on Twitter at PossibleWGames, because Possible Worlds Games is too many characters for Twitter. So my Twitter just has a middle name. It's William, if you're asking. And then my website is going to be the best resource for anything else, www.possibleworldsgames.com. You can go to the upcoming tab where you will find a little section about the upcoming Kickstarter. You can go to the About tab where you can find a little section about the upcoming Kickstarter. You can go to the Store tab where you'll find a little section about the upcoming Kickstarter. But there's also just like information about past games that I've worked on, games that I'm currently working on for clients, and the kind of services that I offer.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you. This was an absolute blast.
thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the show. You can find me on Twitter at RocketOrca, Kenny as at Volfmir, and John is at Crossways GM. Tabletop Babble is part of the Geekspective Network. Go to geekspective.com to check out all our other shows or follow us on Twitter at Geekspective. Our theme music was provided by the Battle Bards.